This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, welcome one and all to the second in this fascinating and wide-ranging lecture series on quantitative training for humanities students. And we're delighted this evening to introduce John Pullinger from the who is Director General and Librarian of the House of Commons, which is his day job, and then by night, I guess, and weekends, he's President of the Royal Statistical Society, and past presidents of that august institution, as I'm sure you always reminding people, have included a former Prime Minister, William Gladstone, and former Chancellor of this university, William Beveridge, but now obviously they only appoint very serious and qualified folk to the position, and John is certainly that. One of his recent articles in the Journal of the Statistical Society was on the impact of statistics, and I guess it's around that kind of topic that he's going to speak to us this evening. We are being recorded, both visually and sound, obviously, so if we go into the question and answer session, then you will be part of that session, and it will be podcast at a later point, so I leave everybody. John, in your own time.
Thank you, Miles, and thank you very much for inviting me here this evening to talk to you. I've chosen my theme this evening, how we understand our world, and how we use that understanding to make choices in our everyday lives and in our working lives and in every other part of our existence, both as individuals and together. And to start with, what's the first thing that defines how we understand our world? It is our biology. It's the kind of basic makeup we've got, how we sense the world, how I felt the raindrops coming down on my head as I scurried across London this evening, what I see, what I hear, and what I touch. So that's reasonably straightforward. We know what that means. We know what biological impulses are driving us to do all sorts of things. Our emotions help us understand the world. We want to be loved, we want others to love us, we feel fear, we feel these things, they impel us to do certain things, they guide us as we come to decisions. We have various belief systems, wherever they've come from, whether they be religious or other kinds of sets of ideas which tell us what is right and wrong, that actually give some conditioning to what biology or emotion might drive us to do. But they are in the background there guiding us, this little light, this little sound that is telling us what we should and should not do. Those things too are straightforward, but we also have this brain. We have this rational side to ourselves. And the statistical elements of what I'm going to talk about this evening are about how we engage our brain, how we construct evidence, how we use evidence, how we think, how we can use statistical thinking to help condition our sometimes wayward hearts, our biology, our emotions, and our spiritual beliefs. And from a very early age, we are taught somehow to spot patterns. Children look up at the clouds and see shapes in them. From very ancient days, people used numbers to construct the pyramids, to look at ideas of order in the world around us. Statistics helps us understand which of those patterns have meaning and which do not. Life often is a lottery, and those people best placed to work out the odds have a slightly higher chance of success. We work out how to take risks, which risks are sensible, which are not sensible. Should we drive our bicycles in London, ride our bicycles in London, or should we not? There is the ability to look at what others have done and help that knowledge guide us in what we should do. When we make judgments, we are trying to decide how to get the best benefit for the least cost. How many birds in the bush do I need to trade my bird in the hand? How do we judge how much we should spend to save a life? How do we make some of these calculations, which are hard and sometimes unpalatable, but inevitably necessary in a world of scarce resources, whether it be a scarce resource of money or time or whatever. We have to calculate to make those judgments properly. Numbers, in a very strange way, have a compelling, almost hypnotic power sometimes. I picked up the Evening Standard on the tube as I was coming over here, and a kind of headline said, average house price in London hits £400,000. And that tells us a lot. We just get a number from that, but we are interpreting it. We're seeing as a kind of power. We want to read the article. Almost every article on every page has got some number in it. And the journalists are using those numbers because they think they will resonate with us somehow. Concepts like 8 out of 10 cats prefer it, those kinds of programs playing with numbers. But what do we really learn from that? These numbers are sometimes just kind of wallpaper in a newspaper or a name of a TV program. But statistical thinking helps us work out, well, which 8 cats preferred it and which 2 didn't, and why did they prefer it, and prefer it to what? And you start to think about the calculation that those numbers really convey. But also, numbers, particularly in British society, I think it's true in a lot of societies, but particularly in ours, have got this idea of being cold and impersonal and not somehow human, not really for us, sometimes many people would think. And yet, you look at a lot of writings. I mean, my favourite writer on this subject is Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist. And if you haven't read his book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, I recommend it to you. It shows how poorly we are served if we engage what he calls our type 1 brains, the brains that are driven by biology, emotion and instinct, really, our belief systems. If we just rely on that, without engaging our type 2 brains, which think a bit slower, which calculate, which actually look at the evidence to help us decide, help our thinking brains balance these wayward hearts. Read Daniel Kahneman. But also think of some of the other people who have used statistics in perhaps unlikely settings to change the world. Miles mentioned some people who were predecessors in the Royal Statistical Society. My favourite one is the first woman member of the Royal Statistical Society. Some of you may know it, but my guess is for most of you it will be a surprise. The first woman member of the Royal Statistical Society was Florence Nightingale, and she became a member in 1858. And she used statistics famously, I think, to understand what was really killing soldiers in the Crimea, and more importantly still, when she came back, to revolutionise healthcare. In the Crimea in particular, it was the very simple fact, once you tabulated the numbers, that it was sanitation that was killing the soldiers, not the enemy. And this was rather startling to people. But she used statistical techniques which now we take for granted. She's quite often credited as being the first person who invented the pie chart. So if you are kind of assailed with pie charts in any of your methods courses, blame Florence Nightingale. But if you've never seen her charts, go and look at them at St Thomas's Hospital, the Florence Nightingale Museum. They are actually rather beautiful works of art in their own right, but they're very powerful ways of presenting data. And she used those charts to convince very sceptical authorities, very sceptical people in the military and in the health service, that actually sanitation was the single biggest thing that you could use to improve the health of people who were in hospital, suffering from all sorts of ailments. It was the start, really, of medicine becoming a science. So many examples of why statistics can help you. But where did this idea of statistics come from? Now, as Miles has said, my day job, my job title is librarian, so I have a natural affinity with arts and humanities and language, so I'm interested in language. It's only by night that Mr. Hyde comes out from the lovely Mr. Jekyll of the daytime and starts talking about numbers. But they are inevitably intertwined in my thinking and my life. The word statistics comes from the Latin status, the state, which moved into Italian, statista, which is one skilled in statecraft. And from there it moved north into German, and that's where the first use of the word statistic comes from. And statistic in German is translated as the information needed to rule a state. So it's got this very strong anchor in the idea of information making an impact, information helping the powerful make decisions. And in Europe, in the sort of Middle Ages type period, even before, concept of statistics was something used by the ruler in order to rule. You think of the early censuses, you think of the biblical census. That's what the Romans were using in order to control the Jews. You look at the Doomsday Book, that William the Conqueror, one of his early actions after coming to take over this country, was to enumerate, to count all the land, all the people who owned the land, so that he could tax it, so he could control it. Statistics was about control. It was an instrument of the ruler to enable them to rule, to help them raise armies, to help them raise taxes, to help them work out who was who and who was doing what. Other powerful people had the same use of statistics, the clergy, the registers of births, baptisms and deaths from early Middle Ages in this country. They were about the powerful people keeping tabs on everybody else. And statistics enabled them to do that with quite significant effect in many areas. Lots of historical accounts of how the census, or the censor in Roman times, was one of the most powerful counsellors to the rulers, to the emperors. So that's quite a kind of strange route in a sense to what we've got now. And the crossover from statistics as this idea of information needed to rule a state came about with someone called John Sinclair. And he was the oldest of the original founders of the Royal Statistical Society. He was a Scotsman. He did the first statistical abstract of Scotland. And he had been travelling in Germany and came back to Britain enthused by this idea of statistics. But he reinterpreted it. He reinterpreted the idea of the information needed to rule a state as the information needed to increase the quantum of happiness of the people. So he was an Enlightenment man. He was part of the movement of turning ruling on its head. The point of a ruler was not to subjugate the population, but to enlighten and empower them. Very modern notions, but just beginning really to get traction in the late 18th century and into the 19th century. And that's where really my story is starting to kind of unfold into why it matters to us now. Because that idea of evidence-based decision-making, certainly in the UK context, goes back to John Sinclair and the early founders of the Royal Statistical Society. The Royal Statistical Society is 180 this year. Our foundation was in 1834, and John Sinclair was part of a wide range of thinkers who came together to create this society. But there were four who were tasked with actually setting the society up, creating its first set of rules. And for me, the four of those people in the room give me a kind of touchstone for the resonance of statistics across all disciplines now. The four people were Charles Babbage, famously known as the inventor of the computer, and his reason, I think, for being there was that the reason computing mattered to him was he was interested in doing calculations, but in order to do calculations, he needed people to count things, and people made mistakes. If you could mechanise this process of counting, we would make less mistakes and we'd be more precise in our understanding of the world around us. So Charles Babbage was the first one in this room. The second one was Henry Hallam, and some of you may have come across him. He was a constitutional historian, and he was looking back at how we understand the past. And he could see in this movement of statistics a new methodology that would help us understand the past. His books were the key textbooks for the students of history of his time. He was part of this little group. The third one was John Drinkwater, and I particularly like John Drinkwater because he worked in Parliament as an administrator, like me. He was very actively involved in the library movement, like me. But his primary passion was for education, particularly the education of women. And after his Royal Statistical Society days, he went off to India and founded a very famous school for girls in Calcutta. So he could see this idea of statistics as a powerful force for education. And the fourth one was Richard Jones. Now, Richard Jones I like because he came from Tunbridge Wells, which is where I live, and also where Thomas Bayes, another very famous statistician, came from, so there must be something in the water in Tunbridge Wells. But Richard Jones was an economist, And the reason I like him as an economist is that we could really have done with him around the time of the financial crash. Because he didn't believe in theories. He believed only in observation. He could work out what the economic truth was behind something by observing it very closely. Another touchstone for the statistical method today. It's all about observation. So those four people, we have the inventor of the computer, a constitutional historian, a educator, and an economist, founding this thing called the Royal Statistical Society. It wasn't intended to be something just for the statos. It was intended to be something that would help us in quite a broad way understand our mind, understand our world, by engaging the thinking part of our being, this rational brain, this thinking type 2 system that helps us use numbers, use the collection of information to draw sensible conclusions. So the 1830s saw the flowering of this, but it grew very strongly throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. And a number of people that certainly influenced me amongst my predecessors, Miles has mentioned some of them, but Charles Booth is one I particularly enjoy reading. Charles Booth was, from a statistical point of view, the inventor of the statistical map, and I have one on my wall, so I look at it every day, and it is another work of art. But fundamentally, he was trying to use statistical method and statistical mapping to understand poverty. And he did that to great effect. And he is credited with the Pensions Act, which actually implemented the idea of support for older people in this country. In 1908, I think the Pensions Act was first passed. So again, using evidence to make a very substantial social change. William Beveridge was going to be the next one I was going to mention. Again, as the president of the Royal Statistical Society, he was working during the war years to think about what the welfare state would be like, what kind of system we needed to get rid of the ghastly evils that were befalling society, and using evidence as a mechanism of trying to get that across, and talking to the powerful. So this idea of statistics as the information needed to rule is being used by these enlightened people who are wanting to project social and economic change as a tool to get the voice of individuals heard by the power of numbers. So coming up a little bit more to the modern day, the person who very directly has influenced me is Klaus Moser, Lord Moser, and he was president in the late 1970s. I think I'm right in saying that. But his famous phrase in my book is, statisticians, we are part of the management of the nation. And he had a very powerful relationship with Harold Wilson, and the concept of the politically literate statistician working alongside the statistically literate politician has been a significant influence in my career, certainly in the job that I'm doing now and the job that I've done before. But it's all about thinking about numbers that help illustrate something, because numbers have a power to get across something special to decision makers if you get them right. But that's quite a big if. And I'm now going to kind of the third chapter of the history of statistics, and why now is a particularly important moment for us to think about what numbers are doing to us and what we could do with numbers if only we had the wherewithal to harness them. Now I'm going to go back slightly, and I'm going to go back now to the Second World War and to a story about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill in 1941 was in trouble, and the country was in trouble, and he was finding his generals coming into, well, not just his generals, his military, his war cabinet, his war leaders coming into him, begging him to do one thing or another. And most potently, he was finding the generals coming into him saying, we will only win this war if we have more tanks, and more men on the ground, and more people out there. They would walk out and he would be convinced by this incredibly prosaic argument the generals had put. He thought, right, I must order more tanks. Then the admirals would come in and say, we need more in the convoys, otherwise we will run out of food. We need to invest in the navy. The war will be lost unless you put your money in the navy. We have to have more ships. We have to have more people in the ships. We have to chase down those submarines. And then, surprise, surprise, Battle of Britain time. the Air Force are coming in. This is the modern way to win a war. You need more people in the air. We need more planes. You need to do this for us. How to choose. And Churchill's phrase for this was, the utmost confusion is caused when people argue on different data. Please can someone go away and produce an agreed body of knowledge on which we can make decisions. So we are not just blown around by the latest argument, the latest rhetoric that some clever leader has given to me. We have an evidence base on which to make reasoned choices, otherwise we will not succeed. Now, from that utterance came the creation of the Central Statistical Office that was based in Cabinet Office at the time and was the central place where information came together and where there was this brokering of the various bits of evidence and the idea of an agreed knowledge base that would help decision makers make decisions. So it's still the same route coming through. It's still the information needed to rule. But here it's looking at the fact that information is often contested. And people are coming forward with very different claims, with very different interest points, and no mechanism other than this idea of evidence to make sense of which claim has a greater validity than another one. And that is a touchstone for the modern day, because what has changed fundamentally since Churchill's time is the internet. And the fact there's even more information out there, dramatically more, unimaginably more information out there, and we're only at the beginning. So we're coming up towards the 25th anniversary of the internet. What it's going to be like in 250 years, I do not know. What I can say without any risk of contradiction is that the utmost confusion is still out there. People are still arguing on different numbers. And Churchill's dilemma, Churchill's problem still exists. But the only way we're going to rise to the challenge of dealing with that problem is to think in quite a different way about how we rule our world today and how we use numbers to help us make sense of those choices. And my contention is that in the pre-Enlightenment age, information needed to rule a country was information in the hands of the ruler, so their power could be exercised. In the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment age, it was about creating information for enlightened, clever people to make decisions that would bring about a Pensions Act or a welfare system or whatever it is. But what the internet does is it actually democratises all that information. So potentially, we all have that power. All of the information in all of the world is potentially and increasingly quite reasonably available to us. And the question that I think the statistical world faces, but I think we all face, is how we ensure that power of numbers is put in the hands of everybody so that we can use it effectively. And we're all kind of way off that at the moment. We live in a world where information is spun to such an extent that everyone is cynical about anything. People see a number and think, well, why on earth is this being presented to me? People are presented with so much information, it's impossible to take it in. People know that information is coming from some vested interest or other, trying to sell us something, trying to convince us something, trying to bend our ear, so we discount it. Information is often seen as something that stops us making decisions because we don't believe where it's coming from. But what else have we got? How do we organise this world so we do trust the information we see? Now, in some realms, we're doing it much, much better. I knew I was going to get wet coming here this evening because weather forecasts are dramatically better than they were before. I knew how long it was going to take me to wait for the tube because now I have something that tells me it's 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and it is. Now this is where information is being, numerical information is being organised and stored, and very clever statistical work is being done to present us with stuff that we know, trust, use and make sense of. That is a dramatic transformation. If you think about it, it's probably only the last 3, 4, 5 years that has become ubiquitous. That's changed fast. It will change much faster And we don't really have to do much about that to benefit from it. But benefit we are. But in other areas it's a little bit trickier. And in medicine, for example, when we go to the doctor or the hospital, chances are we would have Googled it. We would have already tried to get a bit of information, to get ahead of what the doctor's going to tell us. Look at the risks of a particular procedure. Look at the various options that we're going to be presented with. But do we really have the wherewithal to judge properly, to actually have a decent adult-to-adult type discussion with our doctor? Maybe. Are we helped to do that? Probably not. But that is changing too. We're all doing it. But are we doing it advisedly? Have we got the ability, the critical thinking, the critical statistical thinking ability to understand when someone says, if this is likely to happen, that is something I should go with? I'll try and get this right, but if you are presented with a risk for a procedure that says, if you have this procedure, you are 90% likely to survive, you will go for that twice as often as if you are presented with a case that says, if you go for this procedure, in 10% of times you will die. Now, it doesn't take the greatest mathematical brain to realise those two things are exactly the same. But twice as many people would go for one than would go for the other. Now, that's an easy one. The reason we all have to invest in quantitative thinking is to deal with the more difficult ones. But even in medicine, that's a relatively easy one. There's some that are really tough. A lot of the debates that we're having with statistics in the law, people's lives are being put at risk because there is very little ability, particularly amongst juries, but even amongst the people who are the judges that the juries are working with, to judge often really difficult evidence. Is this person guilty or not? What does this evidence tell us? What was the likelihood of this rare event really happening by chance? And there's some horrible cases. The Sally Clark case on cot deaths is a particularly infamous one, where this lady was put in jail and subsequently died for something she didn't do, simply because the jury thought, well, this is so unlikely she must have done it. And they had misinterpreted, misunderstood the evidence. The MMR scandal, a bad presentation of statistics, has stopped millions of children taking a jab that would undoubtedly have made their lives better and saved lives. There are lots and lots of cases like this that we need to stop. It's unacceptable that that kind of thing is happening. It's unacceptable that we are swayed by spin, we are swayed by vested interests. People can try and make a case simply by an anecdote or a whim or a prejudice. Still more unacceptable that decisions are made on the basis of ignorance, when there really is evidence that would help us do better. And one of your lecturers coming later, I will pick him up because you must come and listen to him because he's very good, is Bobby Duffy from Ipsos Mori. And we did some work with him and King's College London. Actually, another one of your lecturers is Denise Leavesley, one of my predecessors as president of the RSS, but also a head of school at King's. We came together last year to do an event called The Perils of Perception. What do people think is going on in our world? How do we understand the world? And what is it really like? Some quite simple questions asked of a standard random sample of adults across Britain, and their answers compared with the reality. How many Muslims are there in Britain? 24%, say, the cross-section of the public. How many Muslims are there in Britain? 3%. How many black and Asian people are there in Britain? 30%, say, the public. How many are there? 11. How many immigrants are there in the country? 31%, say, the public. 13% is the reality. How many old people are there in the country? People aged over 65. 35%, say, the public. 16% is the reality. They are big differences. And the reason they're big differences is because we see the things which are unusual more often than we see the things which are usual, because that's how they are presented to us by the media and other things. You add up my percentage, we've already got more than 100%. You've got no people like us in the whole country if you add up those numbers. But some other things are even worse. I mean, those are very straightforward things, and maybe it doesn't matter too much that there's that kind of level of difference. But how many girls under 16 get pregnant? 15% say the public. 0.6 is the reality. The perception of the promiscuity amongst young people, of the people who are older and supposedly wiser, that is 25 times out. That is almost unbelievable. What proportion of the welfare budget is claimed fraudulently? 24% say the public. How much is it? 0.7. That's 35 times out. Now, how much is that perception colouring the current debate about the welfare system? More than it should. It's the best statistical answer I would say to that at the moment. But that gap is not good enough. It's because people are not engaging their brains. They are not connecting with this bit of understanding reality that would help them make more sense of the world. So, if that is where we are now, what can we do about it? Now, I'm going to read an article that I actually read last week, and this was entirely unprompted. But this is an article from a lady who works in Parliament, and it was one of our parliamentary magazines. I don't know her, I've never met her. But she said in this article, "My enduring memory of sitting GCSEs is being led out of my higher maths exam by the invigilator, who, noticing I turned very pale, was concerned I might faint, be sick, or do something similarly disruptive in the exam room. I was effectively kept in isolation with an RE teacher in a corner of the school garden for 15 minutes to recover my composure before I was put back in to finish the exam. Reflecting back, I am sorry now that, labelled a humanities student, my formal education in maths entirely finished at 16. While I've never had to call on trigonometry and algebra, a general ability to crunch numbers well is an asset I've been keen for the chance to improve. When I saw the Get Stats in Parliament series, and I'll come back to that, advertised in 2011, there was therefore no doubt in my mind that this was an opportunity to be seized. Combining lectures on the statistics used in policy making and how to use them better, and hands-on workshops, I welcomed the opportunity to get stuck into a numeric subject again. And so I've joined a band of fellow numbers enthusiasts, honing skills and learning how to interrogate numbers to understand their meaning better, as well as techniques for presenting data clearly for a broad audience. Will I be doing more of this in the new year? You can be sure I will. While I'll never be an academic statistician, the chance to improve what has been such an important skill for me in so many settings is not one to be missed. So I would commend Heidi, worker in Parliament, for picking this up. This is something for everybody. Now, the Royal Statistical Society did some polling in 2010 and decided we needed to do something about making this something for everybody. We did a series of vox pops in the streets around London and some polling. But the general perception was statistics is boring, irrelevant, not for me, lies, damn lies, and just something else. And that was a very strongly pervasive feeling, even more than I'd feared. So we set out to work out how can we turn that around so that those kinds of stories become much more prevalent. And we came up with this idea of a campaign. It's the Get Stats campaign, which Heidi mentions in her article. And the thought was, if we took 10 years, we might be able to turn around this general negative perception to become a positive perception that this, in the internet age, is an essential life skill. Without it, you will not make good choices. You will be misdirected by the spin and vested interest and all those other things. all those people who are trying to sell you something or get you to do something, and to have some critical thinking about what's really going on here. What are the facts behind this particular question? And we launched this campaign on World Statistics Day in 2010, which was on 20th of October, so 2010, classic sort of statistical kind of play on numbers. And so we're now 3 and a bit years in. And we're quite pleased with how it's going. And we started off with 2 audiences who we thought would really benefit from having a little better statistical understanding. You could probably guess them, but I won't make you guess them. Politicians and journalists. Now, I'm kind of already in because I work in Parliament in my day job, and a lot of the work we do in the library, we are the research department for the House of Commons, so we are helping MPs with any question they've got on any aspect of their parliamentary duties. And a lot of those questions are about how do we interpret these numbers, particularly how do we interpret these numbers coming out from government, think tanks, or a whole series of lobby groups and pressure groups. What is really going on here? And there is a huge appetite amongst them to do this properly, for the very simple reason, if they don't do it properly, they look silly. And that's a pretty good motivation for lots of us. And if they do it properly, there is this amazing power of numbers. If you get it right, it does resonate with people, and they remember it, and they act on it. So we've run, as Heidi has said, a whole series of events and workshops in Parliament with MPs, with Lords, and with the staff who work most directly for them. And typically we'll try and hang an event around something that's happening. So we did something the day before the budget last year on what the budget numbers tell you and what they don't. When there was a debate about changing some of the measurement systems in schools, something about school league tables, what they really meant and what they don't. When the police and crime commissioners were being elected, a particular number hygiene thing for them, what you could really tell from the numbers coming out from the police and what you couldn't. What the real rates of victimisation were for different crimes, and how you could interpret them, and how you might think about using those numbers as police and crime commissioners. So a whole series of events and training opportunities. And I think, to begin with, the initial reaction was, this is boring, not for me. But now it isn't. Even in 2 or 3 years, there is a much greater enrolment and take-up of those kinds of things, and we will continue to do them. Journalists, in some ways, an even better story. Same argument really applies. But if you can understand numbers and use them well, you will write better stories, you will make better copy. So there's a ready pull to them to do it. It's not trying to inflict this nasty statistics on these people who are really far too busy writing. They're actually the same thing, they work together. So for many years now we've had awards for excellence in statistical journalism. So we have a whole series of alumni amongst the journalist profession, both broadcast journalists and print journalists and online journalists. And they are our best advocates because they will go to their peers and say, you will write better stories if you do this. And Mark Easton is another one of your lecturers, so I'm really going through your whole series here. But Mark has been on our GetStats board from the outset and does this fabulously well in the BBC. And you look at his articles, they've always got this kind of thoughtful element running through it, thinking, so what is the evidence telling me here? And debunking a whole bunch of myths where necessary. So with journalists we have this award scheme, but we're also going into journalism colleges and looking at training programs for new journalists about how they can use quantitative methods, quantitative skills to write better, to be better journalists. So those have been our core audiences. The other audience running across the whole piece, which is in a sense where this discussion comes in, is the world of education. Heidi's article talked about the fact that she didn't do any mathematical training after the age of 16. And the evidence shows that we are, well, I've not come across one yet that is worse than us, the worst country in the world for the proportion of children who do anything quantitative after the age of 16. And that is a truly shocking finding. It's a report from the Nuffield Foundation, who are the kind of leaders in this world. We are an outlier. It's called Is the UK an Outlier? It's because we were a complete outlier in the world on this issue. So no one is doing anything after the age of 16. Now we're working with the Department for Education on the idea of a core maths programme that everybody between 16 and 18 will do, but it's quite a fight in a curriculum very crowded and dominated by our A-level system. But the UK should not be an outlier in this, in a world where data are everywhere. If people have no facility, have never had the opportunity to think about using data in other subjects, but just in ordinary everyday life, then they're going to be disadvantaged. And similarly in the university, well, in other A-levels, we've looked at 10 A-level subjects, and their needs for quantitative support are pretty similar, whether you're looking at biology or geography or psychology or economics. So a lot of things that are where numbers are taught, but method is not necessarily taught, and people are not understanding how to make sensible inferences necessarily. And often that's because the teachers of those subjects themselves have never had that kind of training. So they're approaching their subject from an entirely non-quantitative background and themselves feel threatened by the fact that numbers are now creeping into their subject without them really wanting it to, but they know they cannot resist. So working with teachers and working with the curriculum in all these other subjects is another focus of what we're doing at the moment. But then the next level up is getting into universities, both at undergraduate level, and there's been a huge investment that we've been supporting with particularly the Economic and Social Research Council, but other research councils too, to look at how we get into undergraduate courses, but also into postgraduate courses, and anything we can do to foster and support what you're doing here, which is absolutely fabulous. And I'm very keen to hear your experiences of it and how it might be tuned to be more useful. I think it's absolutely crucial to the success of our country in the future, but also the success of us as individuals. Because it is undoubtedly, I think, the case that we live in a world where data are becoming more and more prevalent. We live in a world where numbers are going to condition where economic growth comes, where success comes, and we are going to be bombarded with numbers whether we like it or not. So in this data-rich world, which seems to be our future, we have our biology, we have our emotion, we have our spiritual guides, and of course that's the joy of the human condition, to be pulled along by all of those things and to have these type 1 decision-making things that enable us to know straight away this is what we want to do. But unless we engage our type 2 statistical brains and think about how to use numbers to our advantage, we will struggle, because statistics does have this special power to inform lawmakers in making just laws and the justice that those laws demand, in informing business people to create the goods and services that we need at prices we can afford, and to build strong economies, to give us as individuals the tools to make sensible choices in our lives today and build sustainable futures for our children. In this future world, those of us, those countries, those governments, those businesses, those universities, those individuals that get stats will get on, and those that do not will get left behind. I hope you're enjoying this course here. Anything we can do to help you with it, we'd be very happy to. But there is an opportunity to be seized. You look like you're still awake and prepared to seize it. So I hope you are enjoying it. I hope you've enjoyed this evening. I've finished now. Let's have some questions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. As John indicates, after such a stimulating and upbeat talk, he's ready for Q&A. So please let us have some questions or reactions.
I actually only ever got a D in maths and I started doing stats at King's, and I realised it's a language, and it's an amazing language, but I felt that I needed a lot more support to really understand it through King's because of having such a poor maths background. Really. But it's absolutely necessary to my PhD, so I just have to do it. So everything you're saying resonates. Thank you.
Well, how can we help? Because there is a fear, and I think it's a fear due to unfamiliarity, and that unfamiliarity has come because people are put off at a very early age. I mean, sometimes in primary school, story I've heard is that by the age of 8, and I've lost people who decided, I don't like maths. And then you really are on a hiding to nothing. So what was going on? What was going on in your type 1 brain that was telling you this is hard?
I think it was partly the education environment I was in, because I was switched from a very open environment to a prep school, and it was very sit at desks, and I wasn't used to that. And I think I rejected it at that point, because I'd been in a very much more open, much more hands-on kind of maths environment. I think it's a slightly different way of teaching.
You've been quite simple cues that make a significant difference, can't they?
Sorry, if I could add to that. Anyway, the danger of this beginning, this support group for the, the math haters or whatever. That happened exactly to me around 8 as well. And I think it was not the environment, I think it was just thinking, this is absolutely pointless. Why are we looking at it? And I think it was really interesting that the way you said it, that it's so relevant, and I realized that now. I actually work with a lot of it as well. And it'd be really relevant, in my opinion, to show that side, to show the relevance of it. And,
But I think that is a very strong point, and in a lot of our discussions with the curriculum authorities, that is a real challenge, because there's quite a lot of, there's a tension between what seems to be an entirely correct desire to keep rigour in the curriculum and a feeling that, particularly in maths, that rigour has been lost, which in a sense forces you to theory, concept, what some people call the beauty of maths, the abstractness of it. But that can be off-putting to some people. Tension between that and this extremely practical thing of something that is useful and interesting and relevant to people who are never going to be mathematicians. They actually want something as a life skill, and not to be put off it, so that you're still encouraged to be part of it rather than isolated from it. And that is really a challenge, particularly in the secondary school curriculum, where there is a huge fight for time, and teachers are completely overwhelmed with trying to keep up with all the demands to cover everything. So things get put into boxes, and it's quite easy to lose that fun, excitement, I want to do this feeling for everybody apart from those who are really driven to become professionals in this, and that's a real shame.
Could there be more training in workplaces as well? And is there a way to get business on board? Because I worked for the UN for a while, and I was having to measure stats on some quite grim things on board. And again, I was really out of my depth, so I was relying on people that were local to do the stats work for me, and it was very, very difficult because there are political reasons why they may not have wanted to just give the numbers to the project. It would be better to be able to do it myself.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, and there are some great role model examples. And one of the things that we collectively can do is show those examples that will help people become much more confident and also know where to turn. So in the business arena, I mean, probably the most famous example in the UK is Tesco, which had been kind of languishing at the bottom of the league amongst supermarkets until Terry Leahy took over and created the club card and used the database from the club card as a means of propelling Tesco to the top of the league. And that's a kind of famously told story of a company kind of grasping the fact that if you analysed the data, you would be more successful. An even bigger one would be Deming in Japan, who's an American who went to Japan and was instrumental in the rebuilding of Japan. It's now the Deming Prize, is one of the biggest Japanese prizes, and it's about how the whole of Japanese industry was kind of systematised through this kind of numerical thinking. But in the field of kind of human rights and some of these areas where the data are really hard to get, it's a very tricky field, and people can be misled hugely. a lot of the UN organisations, when Denise Leasley comes, talk to her. She was the chief statistician at UNESCO for a while, involved in quite a lot of these sorts of things. But UNESCO has got a particularly good record about thinking about how to gather statistics. But a range of other bodies, I think particularly this kind of, human rights, refugees, asylum seeking, violence against women, it's kinds of problem where getting to the truth is really hard, but you're never going to make good choices unless you have some basis for making judgments between different claims. So it's possible, but it's quite a long road. In our campaign we set out as 10 years because we wanted to start with groups that we could really make some progress with. And we're beginning to get more involved in the international development arena at the moment. But there are some really good stories, and I think that's where I'd focus on, find the good stories. And I don't know when Denise is coming, 2 or 3 weeks' time, but ask her about that.
Thanks very much. I thought that was really fascinating. In particular, you were talking about being a librarian in Parliament and accepting requests from politicians, I guess. I just wanted to know a bit more about that and about the sort of, because you also spoke about the parameters. You know, you can see a number of a statistic, but you have to know how it's arrived at. And I guess I'm just really interested in this link between politics spinning statistics, and also you also mentioned the financial crisis, and also what the relationship is between statisticians, economists, politicians, policymakers. And I mean, I think it's a really great thing that you're doing, but I just want to know a bit more about how these numbers get arrived at and how honest they are about which ones they want to use and which parameters they're using and all this sort of stuff.
Well, I'll start from the particular and then go to the general. I mean, the particular is just quite a simple description of what my team does. I mean, we are the research department for the House of Commons, so MPs are our customers, and pretty much all of them are our customers. Now, some of them do just want to borrow books, and that's fine. MPs are very voracious readers, many of them, and often writers as well. So they're donating their books to us too. So we do have a rather lovely library in the House of Commons, but most of the work is research. So an MP will come to us with a question. It's a very, very topical one. The Consumer Rights Bill was debated second reading yesterday. And we produced a 70-page research paper going through each of those clauses, looking at what they were trying to do, what the evidence was against each element, what the different parties were saying, what interest groups were saying. So the MPs had in front of them an analysis of what the bill said and an assessment of what the different claims were. Now, that wasn't a statistical publication. I mean, Lorraine, who was the principal author, she's a lawyer, and it was in the area of law. But it's using this idea of evidence and trying to produce it in a way that it's not going to be contested. I mean, that's our primary goal. So if we produce a paper, that is available to MPs of all parties and none, and they will be able to use that equally. And that's a very precise style of thinking and writing that gets us there. And that's what we do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, last year we had 25,000 research requests from MPs. And that's not just looking something up, it's actually doing a bit of analysis. But every single piece of legislation that comes before the House, every issue that gets debated, we will produce that kind of pack of information. So we see quite a lot of life going past our doors when we're doing that. So that's the specific, but that takes me to the general. So where do we get our information from? And a lot of our work is what I describe in the world of information provenance. It's working who you can trust to tell you what. And that can be quite a variable thing. Certain people you can trust for certain things, but not for others. And we're trying to put together a jigsaw, which is where my Churchill example is probably the most relevant. You are getting competing claims coming to you from all directions. You want in one place a means of arbitrating those claims. There's not necessarily a right answer. There's not really a right answer to the Air Force, Navy, Army thing, is there? But it's something that brings it together in an impartial manner that enables you to think about them in one place rather than just be pulled from one to the next. And that's primarily what we do. So a lot of it, in one sense, isn't terribly sophisticated. It's making a judgment about the validity of particular propositions and putting them together in a single single way. On the statistical side, there's been a huge debate about trust in statistics, and quite a lot of research done that people don't believe the statistics they're presented with, primarily because of who they're hearing it from. So if you're hearing something from a particular newspaper or a particular member of the government, it immediately gets discounted simply because it's come out of that place. And this is something that's had cross-party support, but in 2007 there was a Statistics and Registration Services Act that was passed. It's the first time we've really had legislation in this field in this country, although most other countries have got something, which is about having a body which is kind of above all that will be an independent arbiter, but also a generator of the information. And its main body, its executive arm, is the Office for National Statistics, which is the inheritor, or it was the Central Statistical Office that Churchill created. It's the same thing, it's the same people. But that has now got this oversight body. I don't know, have you got Andrew Dillnott on your list?
Adrian Smith.
Adrian Smith. So yes, I've covered all of them. Adrian Smith is the deputy chair of the UK Statistics Authority. So they have been charged, and the Vice Chancellor of the University of London. So you've got double reason to talk to him. But they've been charged.
You have to come to the lecture.
Absolutely.
All the stuff.
But Adrian will tell you about how they've gone about that, and they've gone about it, I think, in a very clever way. They have gone about it by trying to build the capacity to create the numbers in this Churchillian, unbiased way, but have also taken a very judicious approach to calling to account when it's not done properly. So the most recent example was exposing the fact that a lot of crimes reported at police stations are not what they seem to be. And if you're judging crime on the basis of that, you may well be misdirected. And that's a pretty serious question. And that's been published in the last couple of weeks. There's been a lot of soul searching within the police about how they go about it. And often it's driven by perverse effects of targets. That they've been encouraged to record certain things, they do record certain things. And what you're seeing is changes because of the way they've been encouraged to record things. I wouldn't say there's any maliciousness there, but the result is you're not understanding things. Some of the claims made by Secretary of State for Work and Pensions about what's changing in the benefits system. Again, they said, no, we don't think that's right. So there's a series, if you look at the UK Statistical Authority website, there are a number of interventions they have made. So they're kind of carrot and stick. They're trying to be people who give provenance to the data by doing it in a way which is unspun, but also call to account when they think someone is doing something that is crime against data.
And can they take the media to task for widely reporting something that's not correct?
They can. But there's also quite a growth industry around that. There's another organisation called Full Fact, and they're part of an industry called fact checking, which is quite mature in the US but relatively new here, where their sole being is doing this, to look at where the public is being misled. I mean, other organisations with a longer provenance, Which would be another, Which magazine would be one I'd put in the same camp, who'd be looking at competing claims. I mean, the one I quite liked recently was about coffee makers. I'm always getting my ear bent about buying a fancy new coffee maker, but Which magazine had this lovely thing of actually what the evidence shows about whether these coffee makers actually make better coffee, and the cheap ones are at least as good, if not better, than the expensive ones. So I felt quite happy about that. But it's that kind of organisation that is an evidence-based organisation. Some of these comparison websites I've possibly put in the same sort of territory. They're finding you a mechanism to make a choice based on the different claims that people are putting up. The debate currently in the energy sector about pricing of gas and electricity. It's all about simplifying the numbers so that people can make judgments about them. So it's this kind of growing thing. It's a concomitant, I think, of this kind of internet explosion of data, that individual organisations that own data are going to present it to us in ways that inevitably benefit them. But how are we going to mediate it? And UKSA, Which, Full Fact, comparison websites, they're all part of a new growing movement of things, which is quite immature at the moment, but is going to be necessary for us, because okay, we can talk about skills. If you've been put off it at the age of 8, there's only so much you can realistically expect yourself to catch up on now, although please do try. And we will all rely on these intermediaries who will do some of this heavy lifting for us.
Gosh, lots of there and then there.
Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. The point you make about the contestation of data is very interesting. And do you think statistical techniques will ever be able to rise to the challenge of counterfactuals? Because when we look back at a particular policy response that's been applied in the past and try to evaluate it, what we're essentially trying to do is evaluate it against what would have happened compared to other policy responses, and then you're into quite complex unknowns. And what I'm working on is war studies, PhD there, and there are some people who are trying to do a counterfactual of the number of deaths and casualty rate in Libya, for instance, if NATO had not invaded, not taken action there. Now that's surely they're kind of ultimate in contested statistics. Do you see a way in which statistics can actually make that less contested, or is this ultimately just unknowable and down to your underlying theory of cause and effect?
Well, maybe it can help, but I think mostly I'm a sceptic about things like that. And I think one of the dangers for statistics is to overclaim about what it can do. I think a lot of the time we're underclaiming, and there's a risk you go to say we don't use statistics enough, but there's a risk you go too far, and it's going to be an act of wisdom to judge how far and no further. For me, I apply a very practical test, and that's the Churchill test. I mean, what information do I need to make a sensible choice about something now? And that will be different at a different time. It's entirely context specific. And that goes to me with a kind of linguistic origin of the world. It's the information needed to rule, to decide. And there's no grander than that. So I think one of the reasons why I kind of mentioned the crash, I think there was an over-theorising and over-numbering of things and looking at probabilities that actually blinded you to what was really a kind of completely different thing, which is common sense. And if you kind of put two numbers around, this is where the seductive power of numbers, despite the fact we fear them, we're still seduced by them. And if you present something that says, oh well, so many thousands would have died if you'd done this, people are captured by it. And that really is dangerous, because it could well be misdirected, and kind of a proper, thoughtful discussion is likely to reveal more than turning that into numbers. And I work quite a lot on performance indicators for various organisations, and very often they are perverse, they create perverse incentives, and that's because you've kind of over-captured it in a numerical way. So numbers are never a substitute for judgment, I guess people would say, but sometimes they can help.
I did statistics in my first year at university, one class, and I remember the basic rule was you always need to have first your question and then look for the data which you would need to answer the question. Which is, to me, seems to be the opposite from some office publishing data and then everybody looking at the data and trying to say what the data tells. So I'm wondering if as there's so much numbers and data environment, it's so easy to make it visible, if this danger of, if it would be important again to get back to this claim, to first ask the question and then look for the data and the numbers you need. Because it's so easy now the other way around.
Well, certainly my first principle is the way you were taught. That statistics only have a use in order to answer a question. So, and you only get meaning from the context. So I think that will be a kind of first axiom. But if you've got a question, unless the data already exist, then you can't answer it. So the real challenge is creating the data in a sufficiently open and flexible way that you can reorganise it to answer a particular question. So one example that I was involved in many years ago was the debate over whether we were saving enough to give people pensions in their old age. And the questions were becoming different because the structure of the insurance industry was changing, and also longevity was making previous ways of calculating pensions become rapidly unaffordable. Now, if you only started collecting data on a topic like that once you had the question, you'd never be able to answer it. So this Office for National Statistics had a whole load of data from businesses, it had a whole load of data from the population that could then readily be assembled to answer the question. But the data only gets utility when it's attached to a question. But I think for me the problem at the moment is we've got too much data, in a sense that everything is creating data. The internet is creating data. Every process, this whole idea of the internet of things, everything is going to be creating real-time streams of information, and different people are going to try to use the data to justify certain claims. So it's not really a question of producing a load of data in the hope of a question arising. It's actually out there, and the real issue is how you assemble the data that is most salient to the question that you've got. But your basic proposition is 100% right. First you must have a question, then you can use the data. But you may well have to create the data first, or it may have been created for you.
What software do you think is good for people who have not much statistical understanding to work with?
I think use the simplest software possible. I think some of the worst problems arise when people are punching something into a machine without really understanding what's going on underneath it, and a lot of complex tests may be more sophisticated, but they're only sophisticated if you really understand what the test is doing. So we don't know how far you are up the tree with your own knowledge, but I would take the simplest thing for the task that you're doing. So something like Excel, very, very easily kind of rubbish because all it's doing is tabulating. But if you don't really know what you're doing, tabulating may be the best way of really knowing what you are doing. If you get into very straightforward software that is doing a significance test, if you understand what the meaning of that is, well, use it. But don't use something that is more sophisticated than you need. So probably for the sorts of things you're doing, things like SPSS or R perhaps are going to be things where you're not going to get into too much trouble. Things like SAS, you may be able to do a little bit more with it, but you can also get into more trouble with it. So read what's on the box.
In the humanities, John, we're trained to be quite sceptical about statistics. We've sort of been brought up in this intellectual tradition of the last 50 years of postmodernism and the cultural turn, and we treat anything that looks like hard information as culturally constructed. So we take something like the 19th century census and say, well, they were trying to do certain things with this, they asked certain questions, and now we know the enumerators got lots of things wrong. They under-recorded women, for example, in the working population. So I think humanities or statisticians have a particular challenge when they come to deal with humanists, because we are not, we're like every other citizen, we're kind of a little bit sceptical of statistics for all the reasons of spin that we've heard about, but we're kind of intellectually formed to want to know the stories behind the questions that are being asked, and the stories behind the way in which knowledge is being organised. You don't have to read Foucault to know that that's what we're sort of expected to look at. But quite clearly from everything you've said, there's a whole set of challenges out there for humanists to grasp onto. But how should we confront that basic epistemological problem we have as humanists, is that we're wary of these very determinate fixed explanations about things which sooner or later come down to statistics?
Well, I think two answers to that. First of all, we need to respect each other. I think one of the problems of disciplines is we set ourselves up against each other sometimes, and particularly this kind of discourse between quantitative thinking and non-quantitative thinking. And I think that's, well, respect is an essential element of that. But I think, secondly, I mean, there is a fusion. I mean, this most recent bit of discussion, I mean, there is a temptation for people who are quantitatively trained to overclaim what they can do. I mean, your census example is an excellent one. If you get a table of numbers, the statistician's first instinct is to draw a graph with it. And yet, if you're ready to make a sensible judgment on it, you need to understand the social context in which it was compiled. So we can not just respect each other, but working together, we're actually adding to knowledge and we're creating a better decision. I think that is the real challenge of now, because the numbers are there and people are using them, but unless they understand their provenance, in the word I used earlier, but their social construction in your terms, we're going to use them badly. So we need you, and just from this discussion, you need us as well, because this is a kind of fusion of skills. The disciplines have still got their own integrity, but if we respect each other and work together, we're going to get a lot more understanding of the world, which is kind of where we came in. So I don't feel anxious about that at all. And well, as I say, my own life is this lovely Jekyll and Hyde thing anyway. And what have I done this evening? I've told a story. No numbers, or a few numbers. Quite a few numbers.
Well, that seems a very suitable and friendly and amicable way in which to end the talk. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.